Okay, I don't know what makes sense. That's a personal decision, but what I want to just, before I even get into the cost, is just talk about this. All of the fencing that you laid out yesterday is a temporary fence, right? That's a fence that's very effective for managing a rotational system. But at the end of the day, when you put animals on a farm, you're going to need permanent fencing as well. You're going to have boundaries, you're going to have exclusion areas. Those types of fences a lot of times get put in with permanent fence rather than temporary fence. The benefits of a permanent fence is that you're not taking it up and putting it down. So if there are really a boundary line, that's something that's never going to move, that's something you really want to continuously have a fence on, there's a real benefit to having that permanent fence there. Typically, they are a more secure fence. They are going to do a better job of keeping a lot of things in and a lot of things out. There are a lot of options when we talk about permanent fence in terms of a look. So if the aesthetic of your farm is important to you, you have options that you might choose one versus another. They are typically more expensive to put up. And there is labor involved. People sometimes say, oh, a permanent fence means there's no labor. That's not true because we still want to maintain the fence. And it takes a lot of work because we're then weed eating a fence a lot of times manually. But it's a pretty big investment, so we want to maybe have it last as long as it can. That would be ideal. And the reality is they're very difficult to change. This is not a fence you want to put up and then change your mind a year later and have to move. So if we're not entirely sure where we want our fences to go on an interior, this is not where I would recommend starting, but eventually you might end up with these types of fences in a lot of places. The temporary fences are really flexible. They allow for a lot of adapting depending on the weather conditions. They're less expensive. You can remove them and mow. So it makes the management of weeds and stuff around that fence line a little bit easier as long as you're willing to take up and put down the fence. Animals can get through the fences, and there is labor involved in setting up and taking down those fences. So that is part of your management on the farm if you're using temporary fences, is that you are setting up and taking down those fences. So all things to consider. Some people only have perimeter fences in permanent and everything else is temporary inside of it. And other people have a high percentage of permanent fence on the interior and on the perimeter, and then far less of the temporary fences, but they use it maybe to strip graze or to break up a larger pasture. So all options out there for people. At the end of the day, when I describe a fence and I'm talking about all the characteristics I want in the fence, I want it to be visible so the animals know where it is. I want it to be tall enough they can't go over it. Solid, strong, so they're not going through it. I want it inexpensive. I want low maintenance. And I want it to last for forever. Is there any fence out there that's going to be the best at all of these? I doubt that anyone is going to be the best at every one of these things. So every farm is going to make a different decision based upon how they prioritize these things. And that's okay. I tell people when I give this talk a lot that I have a natural inclination towards electrified fencing. I believe in electrified fencing. I had a small tornado come through my farm in 2018, and it took out a house. And the house landed, this is my alpaca pen, one of my grazing species, and the roof landed in that field. But it took out the fence in the process of going through there. And when the neighbors, the people that were renting the house, called to tell me that they'd lost their roof, and I thought they meant they'd lost shingles, but when I came out and I saw they'd literally lost the roof and the rafters and everything, my priority was them, right? That was my job, was to help them get everything settled that night. But I was lucky because I had an electrified fence with a solar box on it. I was able to knock the roof off of the fence. The wires popped back up. I turned on my solar box and my animals were contained and I could deal with them in the morning. And after I dealt with everything else that was more important, right? So that fence really worked for me in that situation. And I think a lot of electric fences are pretty easy to put up. They work pretty well even without a lot of posts if there is some damage on a fence line. So there's a real advantage to this type of fencing. But I understand that other people don't like them. And it's okay if this is not the type of fence you want on your farm. But you're going to have to make your own priorities in terms of the desirability and the characteristics you want. I'm going to just touch on the permanent fencing costs, the wood plank, woven wire, fixed knot high tensile, a smooth wire high tensile electrified fence, and a barbed wire fence. And I'm going to use a cost calculator that comes from Virginia Tech, which is a really nice calculator. If you're thinking about doing fencing on a farm, this is a really nice way to do your own calculations on that farm. It's a very long link to get to it, and it should be in the book, in the notes that I have as well. It's an Excel download that you could use yourself. You can put in your own price for posts, for labor, for all of those things. These numbers are not to represent what you'd pay someone to build a fence. The numbers I have here, the assumptions are like if you put in a rough cost for you doing the work yourself. I put in 1,000 foot of fencing on all of these types. I put braces on all of the fence except for the plank fence because it doesn't need a brace. I have 8 foot long, 6 to 7 inch corner and brace posts, and then I have 7 foot long, 4 to 5 inch diameter line posts. And then I also have bracing taking about 3/4 of an hour to do, double bracing 1 1/4 hours, and driving the post 6 to 8 minutes depending on the size of the post, and then some time associated with stapling and unrolling. And I put my labor in here, I think, at like $15 an hour. That's just my time. That's not what they're going to charge you if someone else comes in to do it. But if you were really, really efficient and you could do all of this well your first time out, this is maybe where you would be at if you did it as a rough estimate of your own time and cost. For wood plank fence, material's a little bit over $5 a foot, labor about $1.50 a foot. And the reason for that is we just have a lot of posts. Every 8 foot we have a post. This assumes that I'm going to be able to drive these posts as fast as I can on any of the other fences, and because they have to be 8 foot on center and there's rock here in the state of Kentucky, I think that's maybe an optimistic number right there, but the reality is you'd still be over $6 a foot if you were doing this work yourself with this type of fence, 6.5. You know, realistically, if you're paying someone to do it, it would probably be double that or a little bit more. So, and that's not including painting or anything else. That's just to put the posts in the ground and get the boards up. For woven wire fence, this is what we've traditionally seen on a lot of our perimeters. It's been very popular. It's the fence that a lot of times gets called for if there's a fencing dispute. It tends to be resilient if we don't do the maintenance on our fence lines. It tends to handle things growing through it fairly well. Traditional woven wire, though, a lot of times has some number 9 wire in it, some number 11 wire in it, sometimes even smaller wires, 14s. It can be pretty variable in cost, but I've used sort of a standard perimeter type of wire here when I did this, and I'm allowing my posts to be about 12 feet apart. I'm doing all wood posts in these designs. I'm not using a lot of steel posts. And I come out a little over $4 a foot. The reason I have to have my posts in this design at 12 foot apart is because standard woven wire, the way it's built, it doesn't have a vertical stay in it, and it doesn't have any real structure vertically. So it needs that post every 12 feet or it starts to sag down and fall down. The other thing about this type of steel is that it's a little bit softer. It stretches more over time. In fact, it stretches 10 times as much as the high tensile steel that we're going to talk about next. So this is one of those fences that works really well, but it will over time have some sag associated with it. The fixed knot high tensile fence looks almost identical on that picture to the woven wire fence. In fact, you can't really tell that that's a different type of fence from far away. As you get closer, what you'll see is that the way that that wire is wrapped, you actually have a continuous vertical stay that gives it a little more structure, and it allows us to move our posts out to 20 foot on center in my analysis here. That means I can use less posts and I have less labor because I have less posts in my fence. It's a really nice material in the sense that it doesn't stretch as much, but it does bounce back if something like a limb or such falls on it. And this one comes in a little under $3 a foot. A high tensile fence, smooth wire high tensile fence, for some people this is a lovely fence, for other people this fence is a no-go. You can see here, doesn't have the visibility as the other fences that we've shown so far. So sometimes for horse people or people that have flightier animals, there's a concern with a high tensile fence. But I've always sort of believed on my farm that any animal that doesn't stay inside an electrified fence is not an animal I want to have on my farm. If they can't learn to stay inside an electrified fence. They don't belong on my operation. So for me, that's not really a concern because my animals know to respect a hot fence because it's going to be hot. With this type of fencing, though, it does need to be hot. These are just small wires, and there's nothing vertical between them. So if I'm going to build a fence like this, I am going to need to electrify it, or the animals will be able to push those wires apart. And the term that we use in the fencing law is creep through the fence. And that is literally what they will do if we don't give them some electricity to discourage that behavior. So I am a believer in using this fence, but only in the electrified form. With the electrified form, though, I can move my posts out to 20 or 25 feet very comfortably with this type of fence. Without electricity, I certainly wouldn't want to do that.
You don't have to put a stay at 25 feet?
In this design, I have a wood post every 25 feet. That's how I chose to design it, so that it would follow the contours of the land. I just think practically here in Kentucky, we would never go further than 25 feet because our land is just not that flat in this part of the state. The further we go out into western parts of the state, the flatter the land gets, the further you could technically stretch your wood posts. You'd still probably want some form of a stay at 20 or 30 feet in most cases. NRCS is still...
I'd say a wood post every 25 feet.
Yeah, so 25 is what I used here. It could be a fiberglass post. The structure on a high tensile fence, this is really important, is in the bracing. The bracing is absolutely critical for these fences. This wire takes tension really well, and it will hold itself in position. We just need to move with the contours of the land, so we need to have posts in there. But the actual fence, what holds it tight, is having those braces correctly built, and then we can put the tension on with some form of a ratchet. What this ends up is a little over $2 a foot, which is a pretty reasonable cost, yes? This is a 5-wire fence. This is a 5-wire fence.
What's the best way to put your bracing post
In an H-brace. We have fencing school coming up in November. No.
You see them high, you see them low?
No, we want an H-brace, and we want that horizontal member above the 50% mark. I usually like it in the top third-ish, just because that's where I like to place mine.
With wire to brace them, to keep them together, or you use them long nails to get them in? You sound like you need to come to our fences. I thought about that a little bit.
No, this is a good question. So if I was building one, I'd use my wire to wrap it, and then I'd have my brace pins in there to hold it together. We will, in the fencing school, though, this is for anyone that is really interested in building a fence, we will build braces by hand while we're there, 2 of them at least. And you will have a chance to build one if you come. There's one in Scott County, right?
Scott County and Princeton, Kentucky, Western.
So.
They're on November 7th and 9th.
Yeah, so take advantage. That's a great time. Some of these same numbers will show up there, but it is absolutely worth looking at the fixed knot high tensile and the smooth wire high tensile fencing. But not a bad price. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, we're coming in a little bit cheaper on that fence. And the last one is barbed wire, and I put this last because everyone assumes this is the cheapest fence. The challenge with barbed wire is that a lot of times we need more posts than we do on a smooth wire fence that's electrified. Where I went out to 25 feet, I came back into about 12 feet here on my barbed wire fence because even though that barbed wire discourages them from creeping through, if I give myself enough distance between posts, they can still make it between those wires. Sometimes they like to scratch on it anyway. At least my cattle do, my alpaca don't. With those barbed wire fences, we end up with a little bit more cost associated with this fencing, and that is primarily driven by the number of posts in this fence line. I will say that barbed wire, 4 strands here, works, but it's a little bit of a pain to manage. Like it's harder to repair that type of fence, at least for me, because I don't always have the right tools with me to do it. I find that one to be a more frustrating fence. They have moved barbed wire to high tensile, so the importance of those braces, again, shows up with this type of fencing.
Morgan, I'm sorry, you said 12 feet apart on your posts?
12 foot on these. That's how I've done it. I know that NRCS is sort of reworking some of their fencing specs, so I don't want to use any NRCS specs currently.
Is that wood post or T-post?
This one is still in wood. I've left everything in wood posts, assuming it's a permanent fence. my philosophy is I'm driving posts once in this fence line, and then I'm going to have to, when something breaks off a post or does something, I'm going to have to put a T-post in there to replace it because I'm probably not slacking everything up to do it. But I'm going to just start with the wood posts and try to choose ones that have at least a 20-year lifespan. So I didn't put any 3/4s in any of these fences. I put all 4/5s and 6/7s in there to try and make the lifespan on it appropriate for what I would want, because I don't want to do it again. I said I'm hoping for 20 years out of those. I'm hoping for 20 years out of those, but I recognize that my line posts might not get me there, but I expect that my corner posts should get me to 20 years. I might even go to 7/8 if I had my ability to, but it depends. If we do it well.
Yeah, I don't think wooden posts will last that long.
Some of them don't, some of them do. It's a little bit of a little bit about the pressure treatments that we're using. We've changed a little bit on our pressure treatments, and there are better and worse companies for how they pressure treat wood. Wow, we're going to go way off on tangents here today. But pressure treating wood is a bit of a process. It's a dynamic process where they're literally pressurizing with a treatment that is supposed to discourage the breakdown of the wood by bacteria, funguses, other things. Pressure treated definitely over untreated posts. If it was me, there's no reason I would put an untreated post into a fence line, because it pretty much guarantees it's going to rot away very quickly. The other thing I will say is that sort of with COVID, a lot of wood didn't get cut, and then it got cut and pressurized very quickly. It's better if that wood has some chances to cure out before we pressurize it, so that we have the moisture levels a little bit lower when we try and push the pressurized material into it, because it's a fluid. So we want a little bit more capacity in that wood to take it up. And some people do a better job of letting wood sit before they pressurize it, and other people just cut it green and immediately pressurize it. And we get very different qualities on what comes out depending on how it goes through those processes, which is kind of interesting to note. No way to know the only way to know what you're getting is by the weight of the material. But if it's still green, it's going to still be heavy. So it's a little bit tricky. People start to figure out where they like to buy posts. The longer they farm in an area, they kind of figure out where they can buy better pressure-treated wood. Steel posts, though, have a good long lifespan on them. The only reason I chose to use a wood post is because if I'm building my fence line, I'm going to build with wood and then probably come in and feed in some T-posts as I need to along the way. With an electrified fence, I wouldn't really want to use any T-post or metal post, just from a grounding challenge. So I put everything in wood to try and make them sort of comparable. And then some fiberglass posts, which there are some really nice fiberglass options on the market now, but some of the older fiberglass had some issues with some degradation with solar, but the newer ones have done really well. There's some really nice fiberglass options out there, especially for an electrified fence. In terms of planning out the fences, there's a lot of different things to think about, and I know that you guys have probably touched on some of this, but really taking time before building, especially permanent fences, to figure out what size pastures and paddocks should be built, and to consider if they all need to be the same size or different sizes. This is something that a lot of people will do, is they will just put their farm down on paper, and they will literally cut it, and they'll give themselves even-sized pastures. And in some cases, that works extremely well in operations, and in other operations, it's not necessarily the best fit. Because, for instance, if I have a cow-calf operation and I still have a bull that I use to breed, do I need to hold my bull somewhere when I don't have him in with the cows? Am I going to do a controlled breeding season? And if so, maybe I need some smaller pastures for that bull when he's not in with the cows. Maybe I don't want him out on 20 acres just because that's what all of my fields split out to be. Maybe I want a couple 1 or 2 acre pastures. So really think about that, and then also think about the quality of your grasses, and if there's better and worse areas, maybe you want to break with topography or with the quality of the grasses that you have, so that you get about the same days in different areas of the farm. My preference is for people that are trying to figure out what they're doing is to create large pastures with permanent fencing and then use temporary fencing inside of these very large pastures to manage that grazing. To me, this makes a lot of sense. I don't want my whole farm to be in temporary fence. I would like to have some interior fences that I know where they are once I feel comfortable with the design on my farm. but I want to be able to better manage my grazing strategy, and I'm going to use some temporary fence to do that rather than having 8 million fence lines on the farm that are permanently there in case I do want to cut hay or do something else. These bigger fields are more practical potentially for doing that. With the temporary fences, there's a little bit of variability in cost on temporary fences, but a lot of times you get what you pay for. I will just throw that out there that there are better and worse quality temporary fence posts. Some of them are more UV stabilized than others. Some of them will start snapping off these little buggers right here, you know, at a year in, just out in the sun. Other higher quality ones will last significantly longer, and in most cases, you do get what you pay for with them. The other thing I'll note is that a lot of people will say that they use pigtails or ring tops, those types of fence posts, and they are really convenient for stepping in, but then people will say they have small ruminants and they don't work. There are a lot of options out there for bigger and smaller animals with adjustable heights so that we can put temporary fencing at the height we need it for the size animal that we're grazing. So there are definitely different options out there, so don't be afraid that if you're not running cattle that there's not options available. There are a lot of things out there we can do for different sized ruminants. And there's also different types of materials we can use. We talk a lot about turbo wire and poly wire. That's the most common thing we use because it's very easy to reel up on those geared reels. Usually if we use a white one, it's visible enough. Once an animal's trained, they know where it is. And it has a pretty good lifespan. There are also these tapes and the poly ropes. For starting and training animals that have never seen electricity before on a temporary fence, it might be useful to have something that's larger like this, that's more visible, so that they can identify it, and then when they touch it, they'll have a clear shock associated with it. It's not necessarily what I would want to use everywhere on my farm because there's a lot of ohms. Basically, it's not as conductive. Some of these bigger materials, there's just a lot of plastic that you're pulling and reeling and working with. But for horses or other animals that really need that visibility, there's things like this out there on the market that are really useful. Yeah, the yellow ones, some people really like. Personally, I think as we get into the drier weather like we're having this fall, these ones blend. These are much harder to see. The place where people tend to say that they need them is in more northern climates where they have a lot of snow. But we don't really have enough snow around here that we live in white for months at a time. For us, the white is visible almost all the time around here. So that would definitely be the recommendation in this area. Also, I don't know, the white ones just tend to be a little bit better here. So, for the energizer or the charger on an electrified fence, you want to figure out how much length of wire you're really going to run. All wires have different capacities for carrying that current, and the 50-mile number is it's not a realistic number to begin with, but in particular, if we're doing a polywire fence and all we've ever done before is 12.5 gauge high tensile steel, we're not going to get the same run with that polywire that we would keeping everything charged if we were doing it with a high tensile steel. It's not as conductive. It doesn't have as much metal to carry that current, so we do want to be really careful and be cognizant of that. So 5 minutes. We'll jump over then to watering systems. Oh, let me just quickly say, solar, a wonderful option, at least double what you're going to pay for one that plugs in on a wall. So if you have the option and have electricity there, you're always going to want to lean towards a plug-in box rather than a solar box. But it's nice to have a solar box as backup for when the power goes out, right? So just something to keep in mind. Temporary watering systems. I'll talk about temporary and permanent real quickly here. Black line, about 65 cents a foot. High flow float valves, 50 to 75 bucks. Quick couplers, 15. Compressions, 15. Ball valves, 10 to 20. Even when we go in with a temporary watering system, I want people to know that it is not a free system to install. So we want to think about how we're going to use these parts and components. But when we compare it to a permanent watering system right now, 2-inch PVC at $2.20, that's, I think, a little bit generous. But if I buy it from the farm from one of the plumbing stores in large enough bulk, I can get around that number. PVC couplers at $2, the T's at $5, the PEX connections 60 cents a foot. I would probably, if it was me, run PEX from my main line into a tank if I was putting in a permanent tank. But those permanent tanks are not inexpensive. 500 to 1100, I think that's also very generous. I think I'd be looking at 800 to 1500 right now. Depends on the size tank. These systems are a very significant cost to install. There's a lot of money involved in both watering systems. So being really cognizant when we're building our rotational system and figuring out how to utilize water strategically is going to be really important for keeping the costs effective on both of these options. And just as a last thought, you know, my personal preference is that I run a hot strand on the top and the inside of my permanent fencing, in addition to using some temporary fencing on my farms for two reasons. One, that hot wire does the same thing as a barbed wire would do on a woven wire fence, keeps animals from pushing and rubbing and leaning on that fence. But it also gives a supply of hot anywhere that I need it in the farm. So I can use one really good box and then run my temporary wires off of my permanent fence, and I'm not constantly setting up and taking down a solar box to run a temporary fencing system in different areas of the farm. It means the Energizer doesn't have to be moved. And I will say that I had some fencing done this year on my farm by a contractor who only did barbed wire on the top, and I gave him all the parts to put in electrified wire on the top instead of a barbed wire. And he said it was so efficient, he was going back to his farm and taking down his barbed wire up top and was going to put in electric on his. He said there was no reason not to do it. It was that fast. So you can even teach a new dog, old dog, new tricks. It is possible to convince a contractor to change a behavior. I know that's like a miracle, but I did do it. The fencing contractor, I changed his habit. Well, you know, at the end of the day, I don't know that it could possibly have been a lot different in time. Like, I gave him, you know, the quick couplers for the ends with the ratchet on it, you know, that are insulated, and for him, that doesn't, if I pay for those parts, he comes out ahead for sure, because he's not paying for the barb, he's paying for smooth wire, so. But he uses electric in his farm, and he's like, oh, I can see how this has value for me. So I do think that there are people that you could convince to do this. It isn't that burdensome for them to do that type of wire on the fencing.
The two watering systems, temporary and permanent, is that above ground or below ground?
So this does not include cost. You're going to have costs associated with cutting your lines in, and that's not in there.
But it could be either way.
Either way. We could, yeah. I mean, ideally, we're going to put a permanent system in the ground. Yeah. But on a temporary system, it depends. Some people like to keep the temporary system in the ground and keep all that wire or all that black pipe out, and they want it to have like a semi-permanent design to it. And then parts of it tend to be above ground just because of moving them around depending on how the pastures are moving. But I've seen people do a combination thereof where they'll do permanent pipe and then connections and then run black pipe out of it, which is also an option. So I think there's even an in-between type of option that's out there for people depending on what they're looking for. It depends on how much winter grazing you're able to do as to what sort of system is going to probably make sense on a farm. If you can stockpile enough grass to get through a lot of the winter, then you probably need some line in the ground.
We played with the black pipe yesterday for a little bit. Is that pretty resistant being run over by a tractor?
No.
Okay, so that's, yeah.
No. I mean, nothing's really resistant to that, to be honest.
Right, okay.
So,
Below ground for me is.
I think for most people, they end up with at least a good portion of it underground just from a practical standpoint. And then it gives you a protection from freezing too, so. Yeah, at least 24 inches down.
Morgan, if you put the black pipe underground,
Uh-huh.
how long will it last?
I don't know. I changed out water lines on one of my farms, and it was 35 years old, and it was black pipe. I think it depends on the.
PVC versus the cost of black pipe. Would it ever make sense? You say I'm going to use black pipe for my permanent system.
You could. Certainly people do. people do all kinds of different, yeah, black pipe is not an unusual thing to see on a farm for running. I would have to have someone from NRCS here tell me if they can run black pipe on an NRCS system.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, rocky ground, gravelly ground, we'll pay to sleeve it. So if you know that you're gonna go through a section that historically is rocky, you'll put it inside of 4-inch PVC. If you've got an area like you talked about driving with a tractor that's going under a road, we'll sleeve it. We
Yeah.
may even sleeve it and bed it in sand. But the black pipe is fine if you know you've got a problem or a risk of pipe, as water goes through it, pipe moves a little bit.
Yep.
And if you've got a rock laying against it, that pipe rubs against it over the course of a couple of years, it'll cut a hole in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if between you and I, we knew it was rocky or there's a road going through there. It's kind of like PVC where you have to cement the joints.
No.
No, you're just, and you may have to take a saw and cut a groove in it, snap it over, just to give protection. You know, we want that line to go in the last 20 years, so we've got engineers that will tell you, here, for the next 100 feet, bed it in sand. Each site's specific.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no reason to think you couldn't use the black pipe. That black pipe, though, is smaller. The one thing I'll say is I have 2-inch PVC in there, and I think I have 1 or 1.25-inch black pipe there that I spec'd. So I spec'd a smaller on the black pipe, so that's part of why that cost is less. But it is less than the cost of the PVC.